All right, Marcus, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Hello, Mr. Burden. I am well, thank you. I am actually quite in a jolly mood, as a matter of fact. Glad I could stand in for you at the last moment, actually, given given you had a bit of a scheduling thing. So quite happy to be here, even though
Oh,
it's been not too long after my double banger on Ukraine. So it's nice to be back. I hope your audience can tolerate me being back so soon.
oh yeah, of course. I was supposed to be recording with Bagby, and then he sent me a voice message that apparently he was supposed to be on a ship, and the ship just left 2 hours early. So he's now stranded, trying to catch back up to his ship. So he's obviously unavailable. It's a sordid situation, but nonetheless, and I'm
It's a bit
glad
of a
to have you
foobar
on.
scenario, isn't it? I mean, missing a ship.
That's one of those ones where I was like, huh, I really don't know if I can help you with that one. My sincere condolences. They're kind of the best thing I can.
Thoughts and prayers, bro. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a little bit different than the last show we did together, which was fairly technical, and it's basically just you and I get along well enough, and I want to just kind of have you on for a more kind of casual, cozy stream. And
Yeah,
when
that's
we
actually
were
quite nice, isn't it?
behind stage, you actually brought up how you think that that's something important in current year. So do you want to kind of introduce it that way?
Yeah, sure. Because obviously, I sort of you might say in some ways I myself am obviously not bipolar, but I think sometimes people's characteristic or personality can have like a uh, a double-sided trait to them, and I don't mean that in like a deceitful sense, but there are people who can be uber technical, uber detailed. What we might call autistic about something. And it's like their wheelhouse and something they understand through and through. And sometimes there's a perception those people like don't enjoy joviality or don't enjoy like sort of social discourse and just, what we might call shooting the shit or whatever, just being what's the word I actually used it before just when we went live, like just literally having light-hearted conversation with friends. And I think that's one of the great joys in life, personally speaking. And I think sometimes, given the nature of the the conversations and the nature of the discussions that people in our circles tend to have, they're often, meaty and detailed and complex. And you know and sometimes it even sort of gets me. Like, I was actually in a space only last night on Twitter, and I was trying to like draw these comparisons because with like the dreaded Ukraine war came up, and it was kind of like, okay, how can I like give this example of a comparison to like World War II on the Eastern Front, and then oh, there's this example from the Punic War, and actually, funnily enough, I think I kind of did something similar when we were talking about it, and it was just like, oh, like let's go back to Napoleon, or let's go back to like Hannibal, and look at all these historical comparisons, and it starts just to get like you can only have these conversations over and over, and given especially the nature of the world as we are living in it today, and particularly those who share the broad worldview that we do, there's an awful lot that can be unsettling. There's an awful lot that we can sort of feel dismayed about, disheartened about sometimes. And I mean, even for those of us who are broadly optimistic or broadly maybe more lighthearted in nature, the world can still get you down. And particularly amongst even like those of us who listen to our content who might not be producers or makers content, what do you call them, content creators themselves. I think the idea of just actually having circles of friends and just talking, shooting the shit is such a good thing for generating positivity in a world that is actually increasingly uncertain and increasingly fraught. It's why, for example, I'm a massive fan of Mr. D spaces, for instance. And people might know, for those who do, I took quite an abeyance from hosting spaces for quite a long time. Actually, both of my co-hosts like vanished off Twitter for like nearly a year, and sort of IRL things got complicated for me, so I just stopped hosting them. But sort of having Furious and friends again, which is what I call my spaces. It's good fun, and it's nice just being able to talk to people that are sort of in your circle or just outside of your circle, and it doesn't always have to be serious. You know, I think sometimes there's like this earnestness as well in our spheres, and it's nice just to be casual and lighthearted, and even to take ourselves a little less seriously. Occasionally, I don't think it hurts.
No, there's certainly something to that. That's why, you know, when you hear Dave, talk about basket weaving, which is basically the service to let our guys meet up, or even on a larger scale, the conferences are so great because obviously some of it is intellectual. You have very intelligent people who are passionate on any number of issues, but the other one is just the kind of psychic or social benefit of being around a ton of other people who have similar ideas and similar priors to you. So you don't always have to be sort of self-censoring. It's a huge relief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not to take this in too much of a chin stroking direction, right? But Aristotle, right, refers to man as a social animal, and he says, a man outside of community is either a god or a beast. He is either more or less than human, and I think that it's all too easy to fall into the trap of decrying the kind of atomizing forces of modernity while
Can I
having
add to
no
that
friends
so
and social
slightly?
obligations. Yeah, of course.
Is that because I wouldn't technically call myself a stoic, but I think there's because I mean people can get the details like, oh, Marcus Aurelius was technically a cuckold and yada 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 whatever. And I think people should also be shy of stoicism insofar that you don't want to be totally blunted to the world around you. I think sometimes you need a bit of you need to retain some ability to perceive things and to actually feel appropriate levels of reaction to one's environment, without like losing self control, if that makes sense. I think there's an important distinction to make. But I think I can't remember if it was Epictetus. I got a feeling it was Epictetus who said that in banquets you entertain two guests, and one is the body, and basically everything that you consume during a banquet, whatever it is physical, you soon eject from the body. You soon basically you get rid of it, physically speaking. Like you perform ablutions and you get rid of the physical stuff. But the other guest that you entertain is the soul, and it's the gift of the soul that you keep forever, and that is the jokes and it's the serious and the unserious stuff. It's the tragedy and the comedy. It's the detailed and the superficial. It's these various aspects of discourse that people like us can appreciate. Where you'll tell a joke, you'll take the mickey out of someone, you might be self-deprecating, you'll engage a bit of humor, and then you might talk about something serious. You might actually have like something resembling a debate. You might have a serious discussion. A group of people might share ideas, and I think touching on that is so important. I think it's a truism that as we've become more atomized in modernity, as we've lost things such as like family structures, community structures, even in some cultures where like the idea of the clan is strong. It's true amongst say like the Irish and the Scots, obviously, and it's obviously true to Anglo culture as well. The Italians and Greeks are very clan orientated as well. Um, certain groups of Slavs are, and those of us who might say were born sort of prior to the most egregious onset of modernity will have a living memory of this. And back in the day, people did used to gather at people's houses, play pool and have a few glasses of wine or a few beers, and maybe catch the game or something. And I think sometimes those of us in our sphere all make the mistake of trying to strip down life too much to bare bones. The ability to enjoy company and enjoy friendship is vital in my mind. And I think, and especially when we look at the world around us today, we need to nourish that. We need to you know, insofar that we're able to, and so far that is possible for us, because in the end, people who think like us are not commonplace. Where we we have to admit that we're something of a minority. That I think is very, very important to cultivate those relationships and to cultivate the mindset and the character that is conducive to maximizing fulfillment from those activities.
I think also the question of friendship is a vital one, right? Even the kind of normie conservative types, you will oftentimes quote books like, Bowling Alone, right? Which is sort of chronicling the decay of certainly American, but also just broadly Western social institutions. And, obviously, the internet is not a replacement for that. And there is certainly a, a false kind of sense of camaraderie that social media can give you. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that, one of the problems of living in a society with no central narrative, living in a society that can't answer, why do we exist? What is the point of Australia? What is the point of America? Is that it's no wonder that those institutions fall apart, because there's no kind of central goal to drive them. And so you see what we see, outside our own doors, right? Which is that people are kind of like listless and atomized. And obviously this isn't everyone. There are still social capable people. I, you know, exhort all of my listeners to be those type of people. But nonetheless, right, you can dig into the data. And you can see that, young people, describe themselves as lonely. Young people are not, you know, coupling up, any number of things. And so I think
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's sort of manifestly clear that that is a problem. And when it comes to what are the things that we can do, Dave the distributist did a very sorry fire department going by did a very good stream on this, where he basically took on the common retort to people like us, which is basically, well, this is all just intellectual knowledge. You're not doing anything. You're not coming up with policy. And while his point was basically like, well, okay, like, why are you supposed to write policy papers when you're not in power? But also on the other end, how, the sort of mode of being, the most productive action for us at this point is basically building social networks and social capital, right? Building up a network of people you can depend on. I've mentioned before that there are, any number of guys in our thing who I've gotten to move to my hometown, because I like them, I want to be around them, and I can generally trust them because they have the same priors that I do. Likewise, the OGC, the Old Glory Club, is very focused on building up these kind of local fraternal organizations so that, if someone needs a job, well, now there's 15 people who all trust you and say like, oh, well, my uncle needs a guy or such and such. And so, obviously that's an extension past the just kind of like interpersonal friendship, making it more formalized. But nonetheless, like when we're kind of faced with a society that's fraying, it's like, well, what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah, they're quite. And I think it's sort of an indictment on the force of modernity that the previous iterations of these things which did exist in the world and in various, societies, and traditionally speaking, Germany had equivalent systems. Italy had equivalent systems. Britain had equivalent systems, and some of them would be more familial based or clan based. Others would be more institutional, or would be more sort of tied in towards, like for instance, the Germans had the. Trying to think of actually how to say. I think like the gymnasium, like like a essentially a Germanic equivalent of like the old sort of Greek um, gymnasium, as it were, but it'd be like a social circle and a social club. They would have like intellectual groups and philosophy lectures, and they do fencing and all this sort of stuff. I can't remember the exact word for it in German. I haven't read I have not read Christopher Clark's book in a long time about Prussia, but I remember him describing this. And these sort of like fraternal societies that sort of have a on one hand an intellectual streak and on one hand a somewhat military streak to them, and it sort of garnered this I use these words relatively frequently to describe such spirit, as it were. And it's this idea of esprit de corps and and camaraderie and elan, which obviously have a military application when describing like morale of soldiers. But I think if you sort of divorce it from a strict military context, that does exist to fraternal societies, and it can still have like a military overtone to it, or militaristic overtone to it. But I think in the end, particularly men need that, particularly young men that require sort of direction and mentorship, and like especially nowadays, you know, we shouldn't we should not be wearing rose tinted glasses, because in the end, there's always been ways and means by which men can lose direction in their lives through history. It's not like, you know, it's not as if pornography was an invention of the 1950s and then it was put on the internet in the 1990s. Like we shouldn't be so naive to think that that's just it's a linear graph up. I mean, in some ways it is, but you get what I mean, Burden. Like there are plenty of things that existed in past times to derail men, or um to how can I put this, appeal to vices that can come out in men if they go down the wrong path. And particularly the church would have been a strong factor in this regard as well. And also, and I've mentioned family several times, being like the family unit. Would every family have been perfect? No. Did many families have problems? Yes. But the fact is, like, if you were to run by the averages, most families actually functioned as families, in past eras. And you had like all these supplementary and auxiliary institutions that existed in a society that wasn't actually um, hostile to its own in group. And all that has been shred from us, has been taken away from us, and we've been deracinated from it in this last sort of, well, you could argue quite feasibly over the last 60 years, but in a very aggressive sense, it's happened in the last 20 years. And so these kind of things that, you mentioned Old Glory Club, and, there's basket weaving and, even like some of the people who host events, like, Nomos and Skildings and whatever, it's not obviously a one-for-one replacement, but it is certainly better than nothing. And the fact that these things are popping up and proving to be effective is very much an encouraging, it's an encouraging thing that's occurring, and something that we should all try and, to what degree we're able to the best that we're able to support them. Because I think the world would be a lesser place without them, certainly.
And I think also one of the additional dynamics is that this online discussion has, at least in my experience, been furthered by making face-to-face contacts. I recently met up with John Slaughter, and he and I had been internet friends for quite a while, right? But then
I
you
also like
spent
Timothy Dalton.
he pretty much just
Sorry.
does. It's next to my PFP, it is probably one of the worst disguises on the internet.
Yeah, I know.
It's only barely an anonymous profile.
Sorry, Mr. Slaughter. We only jest.
But of course, right? And then you have, and some of it is just kind of the social signifiers that are kind of impossible to get through a screen. But once you go around and it's like, oh, I like actually the best example is Red Hawk. I didn't really like Red Hawk on the internet until we hung out in person. I was like, damn it, he's a really nice guy. I like him a lot. And I say that halfway joking, right? But you get not only a secondary level of like, oh, like I know what you're really like, so I can either discount what you're saying, which is very rare. You're not the same person you pretend to be. Or you
You
can
can,
sort of look at something
yeah,
with more charity because you're like, oh, like
yeah.
we're friends. I know you. I know what you're like. And I think that, obviously there are always dangers to bringing something from the online realm into the physical one. But in my experience, it's been incredibly, positive. And, I've been lucky enough because I have to travel a lot for my job that I very often am able to, meet up with our guys in kind of random places. Like I, was able to get lunch with Spader, like I said, John Slaughter. And, again, that kind of like process of breaking bread and getting to know someone, and it's stupid because this was so obvious 40, 50 years ago. You would never have to say it. But,
Yeah.
again, because we live in a time of social atomization, you sort of have to take something that should be natural and organic and kind of remanufacture it.
Yeah. You almost have to like force it, I know people are gonna be like, oh, of course, Furious is gonna make a culinary reference here, but it's kind of like if you're making, any kind of uh like a any dish you'll have to pass through like a sieve, whether you're making like a passata or like a custard cream or something, and you kind of like have to pass it through a sieve and then like remix it again afterwards, and you're kind of like having to like reinvent the same thing, like, but it has to go through the sieve to kind of be able to be reformed, if that makes sense. And I kind of feel that we have been forced to do this in our circles, in that we're the people, because we sort of adhere to natural law and we have a perennial streak, and there are many aspects of the world that we liked, and as such, through modern means, we have in essence had to like reverse engineer, you know, um, social interaction, to the point where we've like had to we have to now reconcile tangible meetups with perceptions of online personas. Like you say, you weren't a fan of Red Hawk, but then you met him and you end up like getting on like good buddies. And I mean, I briefly was on holiday in England last year, and I met like a couple of people from our circles. And it was the same thing. Although, like, obviously I don't really dislike anyone, to be honest with you, myself. But the kind of people I thought I'd like, I'd end up liking an awful lot. Like, for instance, I met up with one of my co-hosts, and we basically spent literally like the entire day talking about history. Like, of course, it's totally unsurprising. But it's nice to be able to bridge that gap. And rather than something being theoretical, it becomes real. You know, it goes from being virtual to being tangible. And I think that is an important thing. It's just that it's a pity we are forced in our present day and under our circumstances, like I said, to essentially have to re-engineer that and like reverse engineer it through technology. It's a pity, but it's the way it is. We have to make the best of what we have, essentially.
Uh, Certainly. I think one of the other dynamics that's important, right? And obviously, Marcus, you and I don't struggle with this. We probably have the opposite problem where we should shut up more. But
Yes. Thank God there's a
especially
stop to the record button, because otherwise we would be like endlessly like chattering
this would
about
be a 4-hour podcast.
what was it? I think it was like last time, like where we did parts with Ukraine. Like you and I like stayed in the lobby for like another hour talking about like 5 different topics.
Yeah. And in true med mode, I was on the clock at the time.
Based.
So just getting paid to have a phone call with a
I have
friend.
a perfidious influence to my Anglo friends, and for that I do not apologize.
But especially when you consider a group like ours, where there are, shall we say, a certain number of guys who are a bit more bookish, right? Who aren't the most social. I think that having sort of a captured audience like ours, where you're all meeting up, you all have the same kind of special interest, is a great kind of like training situation, because it's very, very difficult if you're not the most socially adept to sort of become good at that. It requires repetition, it requires building of confidence. But if you have a group of guys who are already into the same thing you are, it's very easy to sort of come out of your shell. And I think that especially as my audience starts to skew younger, that's some of the things that I'm thinking about, because I've met guys who are good guys, but they are a little bit, socially awkward. And, the ability to take someone like that into a room of, 20, 30 people who are, let's be honest, we're all a little bit on the spectrum somewhere. You don't end up here by being, straight down the middle, completely normal. But nonetheless, it's sort of a stepping stone process to kind of normie-maxxing, to crib a line from John Slaughter's Substack.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also why I mean, in the end, like, there's a few of us older war horses. I know Mr. John D is the oldest of the war horses, dare I say, with utmost respect, because D is a friend. But you get few of us sort of later Gen X and into like the older millennials, which is sort of where I sort of fit. I'm sort of like a middle millennial. And again, it's that whole, those of us who were mostly raised pre the advent of computerization of everything and like internet, mass media in the way that we understand today, and sort of have this sort of touchstone to the world as it was before. Because really it has been a massive transformation. And it's affected every facet of life. I mean, actually, I was actually having a conversation with my dad, like 2 or 3 nights ago. Just talking about, talking shop, talking about a bit of, farm stuff, and, yada, yada, yada. And he's at the point where like some of his friends are like getting to the point where they're sort of, getting a bit elderly, getting, some of them have like, chronic illness, and, sadly, a couple have even passed away. And so, sort of get introspective, talking about life and whatever. And my dad says, he goes, I remember driving a tractor. It was like our seeding season. And he listened to, and I know Rupert Murdoch is certainly not our guy, but Rupert Murdoch was being interviewed and basically said, like, he made the point that the oncoming technological change that is in front of us will transform the world. And my dad was like plodding along in his, diesel powered tractor, towing an air seeder behind him, planting the crop. It's like, oh, really? How much can it change? 20 years later, my father was using an upgraded tractor, like not that one, like an upgraded model that had auto steer, that had almost computerized hydraulics and computerized steering systems, whereby information could pass from that tractor up to a satellite utilizing GPS. And that's what auto steer means. And using, basically satellite positioning and automated steering technology within the tractor, that tractor would go up and down every single paddock in like perfect sort of almost 1 or 2 millimeter, what do you call it, margin of error, and basically make seeding simpler. That also occurred with chemical application. You got to think we've gone from these big chunky. If anyone who went to school in like the 90s, like these big CRT monitors, and that they all had like that off cream color like casing, like monitors, and all the peripherals like the cases and the keyboards, all that disgusting off-white plastic. And now like everything is sleek and it's dark, and you got things like the processing powers orders of magnitudes greater than what it was. Like no one has a 700 megahertz processor anymore, right? The kind of technology that would have existed in a floor of office space, in like the Twin Towers, for instance, like back in the late 90s, is basically in like a smartwatch now. And that smartwatch can record biometric data, VO2 max, heart rate, blood pressure, your sleep cycles, your variances within your sleep, when you're awake, when you're not. And that can't but have a transformative effect on society. And it's one of those things that like humans have evolved over a very long time, often in a very sort of gradual and steady fashion. And then the amount of change that sort of hit us has been very it has been like a tsunami. It has been monumental in a very short space of time. And I can't help but think that the great disconnect between, say, probably older Zoomers are probably okay in some ways, but like the younger Zoomers and the Generation Alphas coming through now, they have absolutely no recollection of a time before. Like everything has been enveloped and ensconced by technology, like to the point where I almost feel disturbed at, say, like not well, not baby showers, but like baptisms, for instance, and everybody has a phone out. Like babies, the one thing they see is like these smartphones being waved around their faces, and it just feels really unnatural and quite eerie. And especially for those of us with a perennial or traditional streak, kind of jarring as well. And sorry, I've kind of gone on a tangent here, but I think even people like us, we do struggle to appreciate the sheer degree of change that technology has brought upon us, and we're probably still adapting as to how to best navigate it and how to sort of incorporate the best bits of it without it totally overcoming our lives. Like, I think I was telling you before the show, like I actually went out tonight with like a bunch of my friends. I got like one guy who has a smartwatch and drives a Tesla, and like he's got the most up to date, MacBook, and like everything is recorded, and everything is, virtual, and I just find it jarring as someone who's not that way inclined.
There's a so look, I'm the type of person that talks to strangers, and so I end up getting into a lot of sort of unique social situations. And this was maybe 6 months ago, but I sparked up a conversation with an older gentleman, and over the course of the conversation, learned a little bit about him. And he was a gym teacher and a coach at high end private schools his entire life. He had just retired. And when I mean high end, I mean, the sort of, you know, 50 to 60 person, extremely exclusive private schools that, the ultra wealthy, ultra prestigious send their children.
Was it a secular or religious school? Not that it matters. I'm just curious.
He had done both, but he was
Okay.
Christian. He was religious.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough.
And so
Sorry, I just say that in context that the vast majority of private schools in Australia tend to be either like Anglican or Catholic. Like, there's very few secular private schools. I was just wondering, that's all.
That's sort of a similar dynamic in the U.S., although there are a lot of technically Catholic and technically Episcopal schools that are really neither. But that's sort of beyond the point of this example. And so I was talking to him because I know a lot of teachers, and oftentimes you hear teachers say things like, "Oh, kids have changed," and I always sort of discount that because, one, if you've spent any time around teachers, teachers complain all the time, and most of them are completely
I have 3 in my
useless
family,
people.
dude. I totally
Yes,
get
you're
it.
you're aware. But this was an interesting guy, right? He loved his job. He loved, kind of teaching kids, how to be, physically capable, how to gain confidence. He really genuinely loved his job. He just retired because he was too old to do it. And what he said was really interesting. He's like, they didn't until they did. Basically saying that kids were pretty much the same until about the kind of mid 2010s. And it was social media and smartphones that really changed kids. And he sort of came out, retired during the era of the iPad kid. And he had an interesting line where he said, there are two things I can tell about a kid within 30 seconds. If that kid has a dad, and if that kid has an iPhone. And I thought that was really fascinating because this is a pretty based guy, not political in the slightest, but he
wholesome
didn't go
natural inclinations of sorts.
exactly. Like we really
Yeah.
had nothing to say about politics in particular, other than he thought fatherlessness was bad and didn't care about COVID. Right. So that tells me enough already. But it was
Passes the
interesting.
basic litmus test,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
It was interesting that he viewed those issues as sort of being, a similar level of seriousness. And obviously, conservatives have been going on and on and on about, the immense amount of damage that, growing up in a fatherless home does. And I obviously agree with that. But it's interesting that, this kind of like digital social technology seems to affect young brains in the same way. And the interesting thing about these, extremely high-end private schools is that there's sort of two paths. There are some kids who are raised by very, very strict parents who, don't let them have technology. And then you have them next to their peers who are sort of glued to it. And so you sort of get a better contrast seeing those two populations side by side in a small setting than if it was, general population. And I do share your worries, right? Because you see kids, I've met them who are zombies. Their brain is melted. And you compare that to, like I think of some of my friends who have older children, friends who are in their mid 40s, and their kids are great. They're fun to hang out with. They're engaging. You can have a conversation with them. And that comparison is so clear. And so to your point about technology and how much it's kind of changed us, I think it's part of the reason why we need to start re-engineering these kind of, what would have been kind of assumed parts of human society, because, that chain of custody has been lost. It isn't normal anymore, although it should be, to have a group of kind of IRL friends, and obviously it sounds almost stupid, especially to an older person when you say that. But look at, like you said, Generation Z, Generation Alpha, hell, even millennials. There are a lot of really sad, lonely millennials, kind of obsessed with their fur babies. And so I think that regardless of if you think it's stupid or not that it's the case, it is manifestly true that that is happening. But sorry, Marcus, back to you. I believe you're muted.
No, I'm here. No, sorry, all good. I just had to I'm one of those people who have like 3 windows open and like 170 tabs, and I just anyway. I'm just one of those people. Anyway, yeah, no, you're quite right. And it's one of those quandaries whereby, oh, actually, I sort of remembered. I went on that diatribe when I was answering you before, and I sort of remembered what I was going to say. 'Cause I was talking to my dad, and we sort of had this massive conversation. And I think it would serve like young guys well, particularly guys that are sort of oriented towards our general sort of worldview, if they lack confidence or they lack social skills, to call, for lack of a better word. Really, one of the best things you can do is, if you don't want to be something, you have to sort of persist your way out of it. Like, the only way to be, I know this sounds essentially trite, but the only way to be not shy is to force yourself to be unshy, is to engage people and just try and try and try. I mean, I say this as someone, like, when I was a kid, I was painfully shy. And I used to spend most of my time in my room just because of my nature. I'm quite like a sensitive person at heart. And, I just, whenever there was someone out of my sphere, in terms of like someone that wasn't my immediate family or our immediate neighbors or a relative or someone I was accustomed to, I used to shell myself up in my like literally my bedroom in our homestead, and I'll just like be on the Super Nintendo. Like, that was the kind of person I was. For instance, I remember when my dad hired our first after the like restructuring the farm at some point in the 90s, we sort of hired a full timer when like he bought a chunk of land and basically expanded the operation. And the family basically visited us, and they came for lunch. So they arrived at like 10:30 or 11, and I think they stayed till like 3 or 4. And I spent the entire time in my room, not because I was rude, but I was just very, very shy. And And I think with Gen Z, there's this. I'm not saying previous generations wouldn't have done this, but I think there's this kind of. Sorry, let me just backpedal so slightly. This point I'm going to make, there's elements of truth to it. I'm not saying that it is not true, but nonetheless, people like us should try to transcend it. However, the point I was trying to make was that I think Gen Z try and explain the way out of it that, oh, the world's this way and things are more difficult and technology's here. And yes, that is all true. But in the end, we cannot change those variables, right? You should always attempt to make the best of what you have. I think if I have a word of advice to anyone that's like younger listening to this is that, aside from the obvious kind of traits where, a person should value things like courage and loyalty and diligence and, sincerity and, within reason, kindness and honesty and, what you might call obviously there's like seven chief vices, there's seven chief virtues, and you should strive to fulfill them to your utmost in life. One of the, there's sort of 2 points I'll add to that. One, you'll get a long way in life being affable. When you are just good to engage with and pleasant and can sort of, have a bit of a laugh and you're warm, put a hand on someone's shoulder, smirk, you will be surprised how easy. You don't get everything for free. Like, I'm not saying that, it's a walk in the park, but you would be surprised just how much easier little things are, and you should attempt to cultivate that as a part of your personality. And the second thing is improvisation. Seek to be an improviser in every aspect of your life. And to improvise, I mean, insofar that you make the best of what you have. And yes, our society as it is, writ large, is pretty horrible. Yes, things are getting worse. Yes, there's bio-Leninism and there's, civilizational sort of socio-cultural atrophy. You, me, Burden, our friends, our friends, our circle of friends and their families and everything are not going to stop. This is a glacial tidal thing that, like individuals like us cannot resist. Like we can't build, we can't build like a sandbag wall against it. Like this is just the fate. This is fate that's happening in front of us. But how can we improve our own individual lives? How can we improve the circle around us? How can we, I know for most of us, and it's true, like Peterson's a bit of a lolcow, and rightly so. But he occasionally makes a good reference, and one of them was that one of the, and I suppose I apologize to any author bros if I'm sort of butchering this, but essentially there's like an aspect of orthodox thought whereby a person is kind of like the center of their own world, like in a personal sense, and they act as like this sort of mooring to the people around them in their in their immediacy, and that what you do actually or what you can influence is that you know by being better yourself, you can improve the life of those around you. And then hopefully you inspire them to do the same. Like that much is in your control. And embracing improvisation in the context of harboring positive, constructive traits is, it is what we can and should do. And in part, I guess the wider point I'm trying to make is if you are a younger person and you struggle with social dynamics and you struggle with, um, coming out of your shell and being engaging and you struggle with sort of shyness or temperament or whatever, yeah, again, not to sound trite, but seriously, take a job at a bar, take a job at a cafe, be in positions where you are forced to talk to people and you're forced to talk to, older men, older women, younger girls, younger guys, your age, a bit younger, a bit older, and you'll actually get a feel for it naturally because there are people like yourself and myself and our friends out there who are engaging and will talk. And the other thing I will say is that try and find yourself in a position where there are people in your social circle who are a little bit older and a little bit younger. Because I think one of the things that best served me was that I was kind of raised in a scenario whereby I was literally like the only boy in like a 20-mile radius of my farm. I was basically raised by like all the aunts, like the grandmothers and the aunts and like the women in the district, and then my dad and my uncles and his friends. I was kind of like the next batch of children came like 5 years after me. Like there's like a massive like demographic gap after me. So I kind of like always had to be older than what I was in many ways. And I had to sort of, exceed my own age in an intellectual sense or mental sense. And you'd be surprised the impact that can have on you and the kind of things it can teach you. And so, you know, I think, I look at groups like Old Glory Club, or, like the entities we've mentioned before, the idea that people such as, say, like Radlib, even like, say, because I think Charlemagne and I are relatively similar age, people like, John Slaughter, we should cherish the role that we sort of have as essentially mentors. And if you're a younger guy, be around people who are prepared to fulfill that role, and will sort of do the whole like big brother thing, and like, take you along, because really things are so bad out there that for some people that's all they have. I don't want to reveal too much about myself, but I've probably got two or three guys. One of them actually sort of like converted to, or like rediscovered religion, sort of as a result of just being in a like a IRL friendship circle. But like these guys are sort of like 5-6 years younger, and like sort of via university groups sort of like became friends, and they sort of treat me and my couple of mates as like older brothers, because if they didn't have us, they wouldn't have anyone else. So it's a very serious thing. So like for older guys, you have an obligation to show leadership, and for younger guys, be perceptive of people who are older than you, who know a bit more about the world, and can offer that kind of leadership and instruction. I think that's an important thing for us to consider.
Well, and this is a question that I oftentimes get is, guys who are interested in, reconnecting with a religious tradition will reach out to me and say, well, how do I know where to go? And it's always a difficult question to answer because one, I don't know the specifics of the area they're in or the specifics of, what kind of situation they're in. And third, I'm not a theologian, right? That's not my cup of tea. But one of the things that I always mention
You and I have the
is,
same problem in that regard.
yeah, well, one of the things that I always
Yeah.
mention is, you should look for an intergenerational community. You should look for a, a, a religious community that is not, an average age of 60 or an average age
Yeah.
of 24.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
really,
A
there's a
nice medium
section,
between the two,
yes, exactly, where there are stations that you can travel through at multiple times in your life. And, one of the things that I love in my own church service every Sunday is, there's a moment, kind of midway through the service or shortly after the sermon where the pastor basically goes through kind of the concerns and updates of the church, right? Who's had a baby born, who's in hospital, who's died. And it's a little bit grim, right? Because obviously, you're sort of seeing the lifespan of a human. But in that, there's something kind of comforting, right? Like there's something for me to do at every point in my life. This is a community I can give myself to over the course of my entire life. And when we're talking about atomization, when we're talking about purposelessness, I think a big part of it is, very much the same reason you see the rise of these Disney adults, because it's very difficult to answer, well, what ought I to do past, the age of 20? Because society is happy to tell you what to do then, the kind of like thoughtless consumer hedonism of, every pop song. But well, what do you do when you're 45, when you're 55, when you're 75? Well, do you keep chasing that, right? As the Disney adults, the 40-year-old men and women who walk around a theme park for children, or the 55-year-old man with hair plugs trying to pick up girls at the bar. It's like, no, that's pathetic. That's sad. And I think that, that kind of,
Indeed.
especially for men, having older men who can sort of guide you, it's like, hey, don't do that. That makes you look bad. Or here's what I would do in your situation. And alternately, the kind of responsibility that comes of doing the same thing to younger men is absolutely vital. And when you think of, and you're more up to date on, up to date was the wrong term. You were more well read on, the way Roman legions or, the Roman army was structured. But and maybe you can speak to this, but even the Roman army, right, had sort of a series of roles for men to pass through as they age. Do you know what I'm talking about there?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, basically, like when they'd introduce new recruits into a contubernium, which is the equivalent of a what would be an infantry squad in modern day military jargon, is that they'd always sort of attempt to bring inductees or fresh recruits into a group of veteran soldiers, because they'd show them the rigors of daily life, and as is always happens with men who live a military life, and someone like John Slaughter would know this even better than me, for instance. I know this purely theoretically speaking. But, for those who've actually served in combat, if they've done like tours of, Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, there are just certain things that soldiers understand, having been a soldier and having been experienced, and themselves when they were inductees, learning from veterans who themselves learned from veterans who themselves learned from veterans over time, is that you sort of have this sort of unspoken lineage, essentially, of to use a gamer's term, like tips and tricks, but like of little nuances and little pieces of advice that make that life easier, or make that life a bit more tolerable, or make that life less complicated, as it were. And it's that kind of it's that veteran to inductee kind of passage of knowledge. It sort of it decanters from usually from top to bottom. I mean, every so often, like, a young person does discover a new way of doing something and it goes in the opposite direction. But remember, that is an exception. It is most certainly not the rule.
I'm going to say something phenomenally unpopular, in the sense that I'm going to extend sympathy to women at large. Something I very rarely
Well, you're
do.
talking to me, so I mean, I'm the one who gets bullied in our circles for being too like pro women. So
But what I mean to say there
yeah, my
is,
sympathy
in
for
the
women.
same way that, men have lost the kind of sequential social roles, I think it's hit women even harder.
Yes, I would
Because,
agree.
in the same way that, combat and sort of training for war was the rite of passage for men, traditionally speaking, for women, that was, the birthing and rearing of children. And when you separate them from that, when the one allowable archetype is only, the maiden without children, right? The kind of Sex in the City lie.
Yeah.
Well, that is much, much harder to keep up, into your 30s, into your 40s, right? This is what the red pill community calls hitting the wall.
Yeah.
And without those kind of sequential roles to fall into, right, is, going from the maiden to the mother to the crone, right, which is sort of the mirror image to that dynamic we were talking about with men. It's no wonder that you see so many people who are just kind of floating with nothing to do, because the roles that ordinarily would suit those people have sort of fallen away. And I think that, much as there has been kind of a crisis of, genuine male friendship, there's been a similar crisis among women. Obviously, I am not a woman. I know less about them.
I would
But
agree with you in saying that's amplified, though.
and it's because, women are more social, more consensus based than men. And, much
Yeah.
as porn is kind of destructive to certain parts of, the male kind of social instinct, I think that social media is extremely toxic to, the female social instinct. And I mean, like, look, like, I'm sure right? But there are a lot of young women who are just kind of like completely like pulled around the nose by kind of like social media and internet politics. That's sort of a drug uniquely crafted to them, kind of at the expense of any kind of like genuine social dynamic.
There's another aspect to this, because actually, I do agree with you, and I say this as someone who, some of my fondest memories growing up was coming in, for instance, from work, and walking into the old homestead and seeing like my grandmother and my mum and the aunts, like just they'd have like this spread on the table, and it'd be like a production line. Like, if you could imagine like Henry Ford's factory, like assembling the cars, would be like bread, sandwiches, butter, lettuce, some salami, vegetables, capsicums and whatever, and just just putting together all of our lunches, because the men would be out working, and the women would make lunches. And I know that's a highly sexist comment to make in current year, but there's this kind of symbiosis that women have the domestic domain, and like the men would go out and labor, and it's a system that worked. Like like, for instance, if you ask any of the aunts or my mother, it's just like, yeah, I would rather be here making sandwiches, and then once they're delivered, I can come back home and just like do other things, rather than having to handle hundreds and hundreds of livestock every day, and be covered in like dirt and mud and refuse, and be sweating, and the unpleasant things that come with physical agricultural labor, right? I mean, I actually, and funnily enough, as I've got older, I don't even consider them that unpleasant. I mean, yeah, I go home and have a nice hot shower, obviously, and wash off, like, duh. But as I've got older, I've kind of like appreciated the catharsis of like real work, if that makes sense. But the thing is, harkening back to your question about it hitting women harder. I mean, in the end, we're both saying this as men, so
I'll be
there's
honest,
always
Marcus.
Sure.
That is a clip of you just going back to hitting women harder that I'm not saying I will clip, but
Oh,
I'll
Jesus
put that one on the
Christ.
sand on the soundboard. Sorry, please go back to your serious point.
Oh no, my reputation's gonna be ruined forever. Um, no, no. It has had a far more adverse effect on women, shall I say? Um, that see for men with the collapse of those other structures, both in past times and in present, like men can still join the Foreign Legion. Men, if they wanted to, could still join a seminary. Men can walk into, if they've got, for example, martial arts talent, like let's just say they're like a kick-ass natural boxer or like a natural MMA fighter, they can just Conor McGregor themselves from being a nobody into a superstar. If you've got the talent and the work ethic and the mental and spiritual discipline and all those other traits that are, consistent with achievement, you can still carve your path. You can still be a mercenary. Like heavens forbid, you can be like, for example, I know like Lord Miles is a bit of a meme, but like there are still parts of the world you can be an adventurer. You can still, the you can still sort of become a man somehow through other means, even though it's increasingly harder like nowadays. But for women, traditionally speaking, the domicile and the family and the wider clan was the way in which the great female virtues were best expressed. And unlike men who actually have a fallback, like men can forge an independent path, and they can actually, if they've got the minerals, shall I say, the raw material, can make something of themselves from nothing, right? Providing, like I said, all those things come into play, and then there's a bit of good fortune, and there's contacts, and there's opportunity, and all that sort of stuff, preparation, and whatever. With women, because they're more of that pro-social nature and they're more of that what's the term that you used, like more pro-conformist, right? That once you strip away the domestic side of it, right, there's a very limited number of fields where women can keep female virtue intact while still living to an ideal that is shall I say consistent with remaining feminine. It's the idea of like the whole, boss girl thing, like being like a, corporate achiever, or being like some like, high caliber lawyer, or, like some renowned doctor. And like there are some women who do that and do it successfully without shedding their femininity, but it's just so rare. And then the other thing is too, is that there's this whole idea of having like support structures. And if you're going to be a corporate woman who's like 45 and is childless and doesn't have a partner, doesn't have family, like eventually your parents get old and eventually pass away, and you didn't have a family of your own, and like your aunts and uncles are gone. And if you've moved to the other side of the country, you don't have siblings. You're not even necessarily like an aunt to your nieces and nephews. The whole system gets blown apart, and there's no support structure. There's no how can I put it, like there's no hammock essentially for it to fall into. There's no catch can. Whereas like in the example I gave about my the farm, for instance, if say like one of the aunts had like a car accident and whatever, or one of them, God forbid, died young or something, or had cancer, there's these other women that can pick up the slack. Again, like the kids won't go hungry, the kids won't go to school disheveled. They'll be looked after because their own kin would come together and fill in the make up the difference. They plug the gaps in the wall, so to speak. And also it's this idea that in a pro-social and pro-conformist environment, it's like this self-sustaining sort of force of people who share kinship, of who share familial ties, ensure that you know and I'm sounding obviously a little bit almost collectivist here, but and this is actually where like I get upset at politics, like the people who say like, oh, that's like a kibbutz, or that's very communistic. It's like, no, this is actually traditionalism. This is where the idea of people coming together and having community should be disassociated with the idea of collectivism, or collectivization, because they're very different principles. And libtards and lolberts kind of intentionally misconstrue those things. But going back to like the female thing, is that it is very, very hard to have like these evolutionarily encoded features that are obviously, not exclusively, but for the most part, split on gender and split on male and female. That with the complete obliteration of family units of clan community, there's not really a plan B for women for the most part. I mean, what can they do? Find a group of girls who are similar in worldview and orientation and like huddle together, like join a convent, even though most of them are closed now. Like the point I was trying to make. Like, a man can still venture. A man can make himself out of nothing. If a man has certain virtues and certain opportunities, whatever, he can become. He can still engage in that process of becoming. Whereas for a female or a woman, you strip that substructure away. It's very hard for them to manifest themselves in a traditional context, if you get my meaning.
I do, and I think that there's an extent to which modernity has sort of abolished the need for both men and women, right? And it's part of the reason that it seems to be everyone is kind of turning into an agendered goblin, right? Or an asexual goblin, is basically because, obviously and you and I, maybe another day can talk about, seed oils and the like, but, obviously that is literally happening in the sense that, testosterone levels are falling, people are becoming more androgynous, but also, the kind of specialized roles like the ones you're talking about that gave each sex its meaning and gave each sex its sort of
Specific
realm,
value. Yeah.
right, have been mushed together. And so, in the workplace setting, it's like, well, a woman must become like a man and a man must become like a woman, leaving both parties kind of mutually miserable, right?
Yeah.
If you've ever worked in an office setting, you'll know exactly what I mean. And
Hmm.
so, on one hand, people will look at you and I, Furious, and maybe we are, by the standards of the 2020s, horribly, sexist and bigoted towards women. But to me, I think you need to step outside the moral framing of liberation, right? Which is sort of the whole thing we're talking about. That, liberating, quote unquote, women, the sexual liberation has made no one's life better. It has immiserated everyone. And so, in much the same way, we look in other areas where, in order to have meaning, in order to have, kind of a purpose in life, you need to accept bonds. You need to accept limitations. I think we need to look at, the relationship between men and women in much the same way. That, this can't be a situation where everyone does exactly what they want at all moments, because that's what's currently happening and everyone's fucking miserable. And so, to me, one of the many crimes of, whatever you want to call it, democracy, liberalism, the GAE, is the fact that it has made men and women into contesting political classes and political identities, which is an absolutely monumentally retarded thing to do, because it turns out in order for society to carry on, men and women have to at least tolerate each other. And to take that very fundamental human relationship and politicize it is just completely and totally absurd. Now, Marcus has just dropped out. We will see if he comes back. Huh.